Welcome to the last of these presentations on communicable diseases and the immune system. This PowerPoint will go through the role of immunisation and vaccination to provide immunity. You'll find that it is longer than some of the other presentations that I've done. So if you need to have a break as you go through, then that would probably be a good idea, because you will find that it will take you quite a long time to get through all of this stuff. Looking at the specification, you can see that we're going to be going through the definitions of different types of immunity, and also we're going to be covering some stuff on autoimmune diseases, looking at how vaccinations work, and then linking some of this to various different types of medications. I'm going to cover the different types of immunity here. Now, immunity means the body's ability to protect itself from infection, and immunisation is the process of artificially inducing some immunity so that you don't actually have to be ill in the first place. This table is going to summarise the different types of immunity, and we're starting off with dividing our immunity into either natural or artificial. So natural immunity is the immunity that we acquire anyway throughout our lifetime, and artificial is the immunity that we have learnt to provide for ourselves. So if we start with natural can be divided up into active and passive. Active natural immunity is really referring to the fact that our own immune systems are being stimulated, and it's actually producing its own antibodies and its own memory cells. So this is an active process in our immune system. With passive immunity is where an individual is gaining antibodies from someone else, and really there's only two areas where this happens. So this would be across the placenta. So as a fetus is developing, some of the antibodies from the mother are able to travel across the placenta into the baby and give the baby some protection for when it's born. And also there are antibodies in breast milk, so that can be passed to the developing child. If we look at artificial immunity is the immunity that we have learnt in order to give ourselves protection against disease. And artificial immunity can be active, and this means that we can actively stimulate our immune system to create antibodies, and also, more importantly, to actually create memory cells, so that should we ever come into contact with that particular pathogen, our immune system will go straight into the secondary response and produce large quantities of antibodies, so you won't ever be unwell. The other type of artificial immunity is passive, and this is where you can actually get antibodies, usually given to you by a jab, and this is where you might have already been exposed to a pathogen and you haven't been vaccinated. The most common type of passive artificial immunity is getting a tetanus jab. So if you've had a cut, for example, then there's a bacteria that lives in the soil called tetanus, and this particular bacteria is really quite dangerous. It actually can get into the body and interfere with the nerve transmission, so that it can actually induce paralysis. And most people have tetanus jabs from the time they're little, and it gives us a great deal of protection from this kind of paralysis, which can in fact be life-threatening. So if you've had a tetanus jab, then normally you would have to get a booster after about 10 years. And to be fair, most people aren't very good at remembering to get their boosters. So if you get a cut or some kind of injury, you might go down to A&E, and they will ask you when you had your last tetanus jab, and you'll say, like most people, I can't remember, and they'll give you an antibody injection just to be on the safe side, and that just makes sure that should you actually have got tetanus in that wound, then that can protect you straight away. Of course, that's not a long-term immunity, that's why it's passive. We don't create any memory cells from that, so it's just an instant burst of antibodies with no ability for the body to actually create any more. So obviously the thing to do then would be to go and get yourself a tetanus jab, so that you can actually get a proper vaccination. So let's have a look at some examples then of artificial active immunity. So there are lots of different ways in which we can create the vaccine, And when they originally were created, as many of you will remember the story of Edward Jenner and the cowpox story, what he did there was he took cowpox and inserted that into a person, and that stimulated the immune system to create antibodies which were really similar to smallpox, so that a person who had a small dose of cowpox could actually be protected from smallpox, which obviously was a much more serious disease. So there was some understanding about how vaccines were working, and in the past what they tended to do was they tended to give people sort of weakened versions of these vaccines, and so you might be a little bit ill but not really ill. So let's first of all have a look at the dead or inactive pathogens. An example of this would be a pertussis, also known as whooping cough. Now, whooping cough is a respiratory infection which is quite common, what used to be quite common in children, and most small children get whooping cough vaccines now, and you normally have those when you're very little, and you have a couple of boosters. And whooping cough in itself doesn't sound very serious, but it's actually called whooping cough because of the sound people make when they're actually coughing, because it creates a sort of an unusual sound as the person's breathing in, and it's actually really quite an unpleasant disease and can lead to quite a lot of long-term complications, and children do die from it. And it's a very good example of a disease that nobody sees much anymore, so has now become, people have become less afraid of it, because like most diseases that we never come into contact with, we don't see the impact of them, so we don't worry about them quite so much. Now, the next option is attenuated or weakened pathogens. These are live vaccines, but the disease has been weakened in such a way that if you have it, it won't make you ill at all. And rubella and polio are two examples of those. So rubella is what used to be also known as German measles, and this is a particularly unpleasant disease for women if you get rubella when you're pregnant, because it can actually lead to birth defects. So most young girls are vaccinated against rubella in order to protect them from this happening. Polio is a very distressing disease which again affects the nervous system, and a lot of people used to suffer from polio, and it actually causes paralysis and can actually lead to death. But a lot of people would be paralysed in certain parts of the body. So, for example, any of you who've ever seen the Great British Bake Off, if you see Mary Berry on there, she has. If you look at her hand, it's doesn't work properly, and that's because she had polio when she was a child, and that led to her having this sort of partial paralysis of her hand. So the next type of vaccine is modified toxins. So this is where they don't necessarily give a person the whole disease, the whole pathogen in the dead or weakened form, but what they do is they actually just take perhaps like the coat or something like that and actually insert that into the person. And so some diseases are so recognisable that you don't even need to have the whole pathogen in order to stimulate an immune response. And a good one for that is diphtheria. Again, diphtheria is one of those diseases we never hear much about in this country, but diphtheria again is a respiratory disease, and it used to cause quite a lot of deaths, particularly in the sort of Victorian times when there'd be outbreaks, and it effectively suffocates the person. So it was a very serious childhood disease, but as I say, we don't see so much of it here. People don't tend to worry about it so much, but children are still vaccinated against it. Now, the last type of vaccine are the ones where the antigens are actually identified and used just to create a vaccine. And this is very common with influenza, the flu vaccines. So they will identify those particular antigens on the surface of a flu, and that's how they create the flu vaccine each year. We can also genetically engineer these. And hepatitis is a good example of one that's been genetically engineered to be more effective. And of course, at the moment, there is so much interest in vaccination because, of course, we're trying to develop a vaccine for the coronavirus, COVID-19, and they are looking at the methods that they have used, particularly in this fourth group, where they're trying to identify the antigens and actually create a vaccine from that. I'm sure we can all remember having a range of different vaccinations at different times. And here's just a sort of overview of the vaccinations that you will have had from when you were young, for most of you. So we start off at 2 months, and with the first vaccinations you get is the DTP, which is diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis, which, as you remember, is whooping cough, polio, meningitis B, rotavirus, gastroenteritis, which basically is a sort of vomiting and sickness one, which is very serious for babies because they can become dehydrated very quickly. At 3 months you get most of those again. You also get something called Hib and hepatitis B. Hib is like a type of flu, and again rotavirus, gastroenteritis. 4 months DTP, your third booster for that, polio, Hib and hepatitis. Around about a year or so you can get the MMR combined vaccine, which is measles, mumps and rubella. Again, Hib, meningitis C and a type of pneumococcal, which affects pneumonia. Then around 3 to 4 years, DTP, MMR, polio. 13 years, HPV, which is the human papillomavirus, which can lead to cervical cancer. And at 14 years, tetanus and diphtheria boosters and various other ones like meningitis, different types of those. So we're really well protected against a range of different diseases which would have been very serious and created a lot of infant mortality in the past. Vaccines work by giving the person an injection of either the weakened or the dead version of that vaccine, according to the type of vaccination that we're using. And this will then stimulate the body to create large numbers of antibodies by this process of clonal selection. So the B cells and the T cells will be selected for that will match up with that antigen, and so that clonal selection process gets started. You often get a second or third dose of this injection, and that will then really encourage large numbers of antibodies, large numbers of memory cells, and this will then mean that they will sit in your lymphatic tissue or your bone marrow, and should you come into contact with it again, then you'll get a very rapid clonal expansion so that you won't become ill. Vaccinations vary in how long they last. Cholera seems to be about 2 years, tetanus seems to last about 10 years, and if you've had a polio or MMR vaccination, they could give you lifelong protection. It's also worth remembering that some vaccinations that we have when we're babies are only really important when we're babies, simply because of the fact that that's when we'd be most vulnerable to that disease. So elderly people are quite often offered things like flu vaccines every year, and anyone who has a compromised immune system, because they're the people that will benefit most from having that vaccination. Most people actually don't necessarily need it if you're fit and healthy. So this creates this idea of herd immunity, which we've been hearing quite a lot about in relation to the COVID-19. So what happens when you create herd immunity? Now this is really whereby, as long as a large number of people in a community have actually been vaccinated, then the chances are those people will not be able to catch the disease and therefore pass that disease on to anybody else. So if the vast majority of people are actually immune, even if they come into contact with that disease, they won't be ill. And because they're not going to be ill, they cannot pass it on to other people. Now, not everybody in a community is able to be vaccinated. It could be that some people shouldn't be vaccinated because they have a compromised immune system, and or they might be too old, and therefore they might actually be affected by the vaccination itself. And of course, not everybody chooses to be vaccinated. So at the moment in this country, vaccination is a personal choice. In some countries, children aren't allowed to go to school unless they are vaccinated, because herd immunity is such an important part of society to keep everybody safe. So they do reduce epidemics, and of course the original plan with coronavirus was to allow it to spread throughout the population, and people would get ill, then get better. Some people obviously wouldn't recover from that, but that happens every year in the flu vaccination and the flu virus. But the idea would be that most people would recover, which they do even with COVID-19, and then gradually the community would become immune, and we'd get this herd immunity. While this immunity was being developed, by it spreading naturally in the population, the most vulnerable members of society would remain out of circulation, so that they'd be much less likely to become infected. And of course what we found is that hasn't really been effective enough, because the disease has spread far too quickly and people have become too ill for that process to be effective. This diagram shows how herd immunity works. If we look at the top diagram, you can see that nobody is immunised if they're in blue, and but if they're red, they have not been immunised and they've become sick. So you can see in the very top diagram we've got a small number of people, 2 people there, who have picked up the disease, and they're in amongst the normal community. And very rapidly that disease spreads throughout that population, because virtually everybody they come into contact with is able to pick up that disease, so they will become infected. Now if we look down at the bottom diagram, we can see that people in yellow have been immunised and remain healthy. So even though we do have people who are not immunised, they are much less likely to come into contact with the red people, because the majority of people the red people come into contact with are the immunised people. And as long as the immunised people are in between the affected and the non-vaccinated, then they won't become ill. So in fact, the immunised people are effectively protecting the non-immunised people, because they are intermediates between the infected and the non-infected. If you are not vaccinated, so in blue, and you come into direct contact with one of the red people, then you will become ill, and that obviously is still going to happen if people are not vaccinated. And that's of course what's happening at the moment, because at the moment we don't really know if anyone has immunity with coronavirus, and also how long that immunity works for. And also we don't know how many people have actually had the disease, because there are quite a lot of reports suggesting that not everybody shows symptoms. So there are lots of unknowns, and those will probably be being researched, and the questions will be answered over the coming months. So we are in the middle at the moment of what has been designated a pandemic, and this is what we call infections that go all the way across the world. And there have been ones in the past. There was SARS in the early 2000s, and of course COVID-19 is a version of SARS. But we've also had the other types. There's been MERS, and there's also been bird flu. Those ones didn't develop into anything major. They seem to sort of fizzle out in a way that COVID-19 hasn't done. Now this brings me on to an example of the last time we had a really major pandemic, and this was Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920, and it was an incredible, it had an incredible impact upon the world. And you will see lots of variations in the numbers of people that supposedly died from Spanish flu, but if we say that around 50 million deaths which were attributed to it. Now the death rate is always a problem with something like this, because of the fact that we generally don't always get good reporting of diseases. In our country, perhaps we would expect that reporting to be more accurate, because we have public health, and therefore we have diseases which are reported, and that allows us to keep an eye on what's going on. But in large parts of the world, there are no public health services that report upon the general health of the population, and in that instance you aren't going to know how many people are suffering from a disease and what its spread is. And of course in poor parts of the world that is more normal than the situation we have in this country. So we don't really know for sure how many people did die from Spanish flu, but the estimates are in the area of about 50 million, and particularly high numbers of people dying in places in the Indian subcontinent. Now when you think about that number, that was over 3% of the world population, and it killed more people than World War I, which had just ended. Now one of the things that distinguished Spanish flu from most types of flu is that mostly flu is a disease that happens every year, and it's the elderly and the unwell that are most vulnerable to that disease. Quite often people who get flu die from complications like pneumonia that develop afterwards, which is very similar to what's been happening to COVID-19. But in this instance, Spanish flu was particularly dangerous for younger people. So what we seemed to find was that the reason that they thought this happened was that people who were young and fit and healthy had such a major immune response to this disease that it caused something called a cytokine storm. And a cytokine storm, if you remember what cytokines do, cytokines stimulate the white blood cells, so the B cells to divide, and the T helper cells, and the T killer cells. It encourages this increase in these cells, and also phagocytes. And this then causes a flood of these white blood cells into the tissue, into the lungs, and this then causes an enormous amount of tissue fluid to develop in the lungs, which effectively this accumulation of fluid in the lungs caused people to have much reduced gas exchange, and so they died. And this is actually something that seems to be happening at the moment with COVID-19, but at the moment I think most people aren't completely sure about what's going on with that situation. But I also will forward you a link so you can read a bit more about Spanish flu. So when we've had a look in the past about vaccination programs, there have been quite a lot of successful ones in the past. In order to actually have a successful vaccination program, which is what we're hoping for with COVID-19, you need to develop a successful and useful vaccine. And that's obviously the first challenge of all. So creating the vaccine in the first place can be quite a challenge, and that's partly to do with how complicated the disease is, and where the disease hides. For example, it's been very difficult to create a vaccine for HIV simply because of the fact that the disease itself hides inside the immune system, so it's very difficult for a vaccine to access that. You need to have very few side effects, if any, because people won't take the vaccine if they think there is one. The mechanisms to produce, store and transport the vaccine have to be easy and efficient. If it becomes very difficult in order to store the vaccine, for example, maybe it has to be kept in very cold conditions, it makes it very hard for that vaccine to be distributed. You need to be able to give the vaccine at the right time to the right groups of people. So you need to, for example, make sure that you give the vaccine to babies so that babies are protected from things like measles, mumps and rubella. Flu more likely to be given to elderly people so that they are most likely to be protected. And a vaccine must create herd immunity by vaccinating the largest numbers of people, so in that sort of 80% category. If we have a look at smallpox, smallpox was a disease which was really frightening back in the sort of 1800s, and we can see a picture here of somebody that was suffering from it. And in fact, this disease has been completely eradicated from the world, although they do actually have a couple of samples of smallpox just in case they ever need it again. But it was a really successful campaign, and the reasons why was we had the vaccine was very safe, it was very simple to produce, so therefore it allowed people to actually take the vaccine and people would use it. The vaccine was effective and it persisted in the body, so it was actually quite a good vaccine, and it actually did create immunity. You could produce it easily and it wasn't difficult to give to people, so people had simple injection and you didn't need to have lots of follow-ups in order to keep them vaccinated. It was genetically stable. A virus that changes all the time makes it very difficult to create a vaccine for it. That's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to create a vaccine to the cold, because the cold doesn't stay the same, and colds are all slightly different, so its constant mutation rate makes it hard to produce a vaccine. How serious the disease was also encouraged people to be vaccinated. Because smallpox was so serious, everybody wanted to be vaccinated, and that generally encourages the vaccination rate. People could also identify who was affected. It's very easy to identify somebody with smallpox. So if you had an outbreak, then you could immediately identify everybody that had been in contact with them, and you could vaccinate around that group. So we've got sort of protection vaccination. The virus doesn't remain in the body after it's been infected. So once you've had it, you lose it. You don't remain able to spread it to other people. No vector or host organism involved, which is also very important, so there's no chance of spreading it between something like malaria, for example, which has the ability to be passed between the mosquitoes, so it does make it more complicated. And they created a worldwide vaccination program with the World Health Organization, and they really set out to just to remove this disease from the world, and they invested a huge amount of money in it, and it was very successful. We've had a much less success rate in controlling measles. It's only 95% effective, and we have complicated antigens, so that's why the vaccine isn't always 100% effective. Some people don't even respond to the vaccination in the first place, so you need extra boosters. So some people do get the disease and keep getting the disease, which suggests that it's not a simple disease in itself. A lot of people didn't want to have their children vaccinated with the MMR. And in fact, a lot of people did the alternative where they had 3 separate vaccinations: measles, mumps and rubella. But that would then actually really draw out the process, because to have the measles vaccination, you had to have it on a separate day and separate time to the mumps and the rubella. And so the whole process of vaccinating took several months for it to be completed, in which case the children could actually have got the disease before they were fully protected. And actually, they also found that quite a lot of people that had the measles vaccination, say sort of 15-16 years ago, weren't protected at all because the measles vaccination hadn't really worked at all. So actually, it always pays to make sure that you have checked that your vaccinations were effective. So we've got vaccinations for cholera and TB. You don't need to know much about cholera, but it's worthwhile just mentioning it here. And TB is a disease that you will have covered in your own work. So cholera remains in the intestines. So because it's in the intestines, it's very difficult for the antibodies to get to it. So the antibodies circulate in the blood fluids, and therefore cholera in itself is not easy to reach. And that's why the cholera vaccination isn't particularly effective. People do get cholera vaccinations, but they don't always work. So they've also given an oral vaccination, which then would mean that the antibodies and the antigens were actually being introduced into the intestines, and also it makes it very much more easy for it to actually be administered to people. Populations that are very mobile tend to be most vulnerable to cholera, particularly ones like refugees, that type of thing, and that also makes it much more difficult to control because people are not stable, so it's hard to know where to vaccinate. We also have something called antigenic drift, and this is really where the antigens change all the time in cholera, which makes it very difficult to create a stable vaccine which will treat the cholera reliably. TB causes an increase in HIV and also other opportunistic infections, and it actually people have been vaccinated against TB, but in fact one of the main improvements to TB was the fact that people improved their standard of living, so reduced overcrowding, because TB spreads by droplet infection, and actually overcrowding and people living in slums spread TB more efficiently than anything else. And in fact what they found was that the vaccination worked, but the improvement in living standards probably was the biggest improvement. And actually now TB is becoming more common again because the vaccine has become less effective because TB has changed. So just going to mention before we finish off on this topic about anti-vaccination. There are a whole group of people called Antivaxxers. Now I'm not going to take a particular stand here other than I'm just going to present the information to you. I would say that I think vaccinations have been really important, and I think that it's as a scientist I like to go on the evidence, and from that point of view I feel like maybe a lot of the anti-vaccination campaigns are not necessarily based on science, and also I think probably the reduced amount of time we see disease has made us become less fearful of disease, but perhaps that's all going to change after having seen, when you get something like the COVID-19, just how serious disease can be. We're not as removed from it as we used to be. So why do people choose not to be vaccinated? Firstly, people are concerned about the vaccination and how it might affect your health. So there was a lot of discredited links between the MMR and autism. So in this map, it shows you the numbers of people that became vaccinated, and what we can see is in this map the numbers of people that developed measles. And what you can see here quite clearly is that in around London the vaccination rate became quite low, and also the amount of numbers of people that suffer from measles became quite high. So we know that there's a link between not being vaccinated and outbreaks of diseases which in the past were not that serious, but now are becoming much more serious because they're becoming more widespread. So a scientist, a doctor, claimed that there was a link between MMR and autism, and it had a devastating effect on the vaccination rates. And lots of people chose not to let their children be vaccinated. And it is understandable, because you obviously don't wish to expose your children to something which might then lead to them having problems. But I think the rise in the number of children with autism has shown to have been really due to the way in which autism is being diagnosed, and there haven't been any real genuine links between MMR and autism. So people become afraid as well of becoming unwell. There's a huge movement in America where people are actually being told to question whether or not vaccinations really are likely to cause you to become unwell. So, and here's an example of a billboard in Tucson, Arizona, which says, this is a group of anti-vaxxers saying, if you let your children be vaccinated, you're basically going to let them become ill. General mistrust of governments and science has caused a rise in these anti-vaxxers, and actually I feel like a lot of this is to do with the fact that people don't necessarily understand the science well enough, so they feel like these conspiracy theories sound more interesting than perhaps the actual science itself. And there has been quite a lot of talk recently, even with COVID-19, about the idea that it was the vaccinations are going to be all to do with controlling people's minds, and I think we all know that that's probably unlikely. And they often feel that they're unnecessary. So in this instance here, we can see on these pictures that diseases which we have not come across very much in the past are now becoming more common again. So whooping cough, which didn't seem to be that important, we're having outbreaks, and people are starting to see the disease again. When you don't see it, people don't see the need to have the vaccination. So I think that's been a big major contributor. People become relaxed about the disease and don't feel it's important because they never see anyone get it, and they don't see the seriousness of it. So things like measles, people think it's just a rash and you get better, but they don't realise that a lot of children do die from measles. So we're just going to mention now about autoimmune diseases. This is when the immune system stops recognising cells and starts to attack the body's own system. So normally the immune system understands that we've got our own tissues and we don't attack them, but in some cases the immune system stops remembering this. And we've got a whole range of autoimmune diseases where the immune system starts attacking our healthy tissues and making us unwell. Multiple sclerosis is one. Celiac disease, which is with the intestine, becomes intolerant to proteins like gluten. Addison's disease, which affects the adrenal glands. Psoriasis, which is a type of skin disease. And the three most common ones are rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and type 1 diabetes. Let's quickly go through each of these. So type 1 diabetes then. This is where the immune system destroys the beta cells that make insulin in the islets of Langerhans. So a normal healthy pancreas produces insulin, but if you are a type 1 diabetic, these beta cells in the islets of Langerhans are being destroyed by the immune system, so they now no longer produce insulin, and so your blood glucose levels rise. Obviously this is not the same as type 2 diabetics, where they have very raised levels of insulin, but the body is not responding to it. Rheumatoid arthritis is a disease where the immune system sets an immune response to the joints, particularly of places like the hands and the feet. And the result of this is you get the inflammatory response, and the inflammation then leads to scarring and swelling of those joints. And as we can see, this person here is probably an elderly lady who's had a large number of incidents where she's had inflammation of her knuckles and of her finger joints, and you can see that this has led to a lot of inflammation and a lot of scarring, and this then leads to deformity of these particular joints. Now, in the past, rheumatoid arthritis was something that nobody could seem to keep control of, and they used to just give people painkillers, and that was pretty much all they could do. These days, it's much more controllable. They use things like immunosuppressing drugs, like something, for example, like methotrexate, and various other ones, which actually reduce the immune response in the first place, and they have been quite successful. There are side effects, of course, to that, and having immunosuppressants can mean the person is more susceptible to other diseases. There is a lot of research going on into these diseases because it's quite widespread. We do know that quite a lot of people suffer from autoimmune diseases, and particularly things like rheumatoid arthritis, and so there's quite a lot of research in developing drugs which are quite effective. So I think we're seeing quite a lot of progress in that. Lupus is another autoimmune disease, very, very similar in fact to rheumatoid arthritis, and in fact treated quite often in a very similar way with very similar drugs. But its effects are much more serious in that it affects the organs, the kidneys and the liver, and quite often it's noticeable that a person who suffers with lupus has a persistent facial rash. Now, we don't understand why some people have these autoimmune diseases. We know that there is a genetic element with some of them. So, for example, lupus, diabetes type 1 seem to have a genetic element. But what we don't understand is what triggers it off, because you can have identical twins and they won't both necessarily develop this autoimmune disease. So this is an area where there's a lot of research going on. The last thing we're just going to mention on this PowerPoint is about medications. So you can have drugs and medications which do a number of different things. So firstly, we might want them to reduce our pain, so things like aspirin and opiates like morphine, which are very effective at reducing pain and controlling the symptoms of pain. Antibiotics, now their job is to destroy pathogens like any bacteria which we might use something like penicillin for, streptomycin, tetracycline, various other ones. Other drugs could be things like hormones. So if you are type 1 diabetic, you might be taking insulin. So it's perhaps not strictly a drug, but it is actually something that we need to take as a medication. And some things that we take are going to restore normal functions. So, for example, we might want to have statins, which reduce our blood cholesterol. We might take something called digoxin, which actually naturally occurs in flowers of foxgloves, and these ones will actually modify your heartbeat. And it's just worth remembering that quite a lot of drugs are naturally occurring, and of course originally that's where all of them were originally obtained from. So aspirin coming from willow bark, morphine from the opium poppy, penicillin comes from mould. We've also got new ones like vancomycin, which is a new antibiotic which has come from a soil fungus. So this really kind of links in with the biodiversity topic and shows how important it is for us to actually maintain our biodiversity, because it's quite likely that there's plenty more medications and drugs that can be obtained from plants and mostly plants probably, but other microorganisms which in areas that we haven't really discovered yet. So obviously if we destroy them, we're never going to know about them. But just lastly brings us on to this thing called pharmacogenetics. Now pharmaceutical companies now design drugs which can actually be tailor-made for individuals. Now what we know is that people take medications and there are often side effects, and those side effects can be quite serious. Some people, for example, might take a drug and it might work really well for them. For somebody else, it might start working well and then might become quite toxic. And that's really to do with whether or not we have the ability to process that drug. Some people take drugs which become toxic in the system very quickly, and that actually can cause them more harm than good. So quite often now, certain drugs, people will need to have their DNA checked, and you need to make sure that you actually have the ability to process that drug properly without it becoming toxic. So we would describe this as personalised pharmaceuticals, and this really is an area of quite a lot of future development, and I think probably in the next sort of 50 years will become much more sort of standard. Now obviously this isn't necessarily required for certain things, like if you've need a painkiller, quite likely the painkillers will probably work regardless of what your genetics are. But certainly with more targeted drugs, for example chemotherapy drugs or cancer treatments, then the knowing a bit about your genetics will obviously help. And also it links back to this idea as to why some people develop a genetic disease when others don't. So things like rheumatoid arthritis do tend to run in families, and yet they don't necessarily affect every single person the same. So knowing a little bit about the genetics will also perhaps allow us to make sure that the drugs work well. There is a link there which I'll put onto a sheet which gives you a bit about pharmacogenetics. So there are some tasks that I want you to do with this PowerPoint. Think a bit about how we could control malaria. Think a bit about how vaccination has or hasn't worked in relation to malaria. And also there are some past paper questions as well, which I'm going to put with this presentation. And that brings us to the end of all of the information that we need to know on the human immune response and disease. So that should keep you busy for quite some time, and obviously I'm going to include with these presentations all the paperwork that you need in order to make good notes as you go along. And hopefully most of you will find that you have a good understanding of this topic, so that by the time we get back we can I can assess your progress and make sure that everybody can understand what they're doing. There is one more presentation, but it's on plant diseases, so I will be adding that into the list as well, but obviously that works in a slightly different way to all the series that we've done so far. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful, and obviously any problems, do contact me and I will try and help as much as I can. Thank you very much everybody.